St. Mark's Cathedral acknowledges that we gather on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people who are still here, and we honor with gratitude the land itself and the life of all the Coast Salish tribes. God be with you. Let us pray. Holy One, we give you thanks for the gift of this day, for the gift of life in it, for the gift of community that gathers in your name, for the gift of Erin as she offers wisdom into our mix, and that we might listen with open ears to her and to one another and to you, O God. May your Spirit guide us in it all, and may we know your blessings this day and always. Amen. Well, again, welcome, and welcome to those joining on Zoom as well. We're delighted that you're here, and if this is a new setting for you, just a couple of orienting pieces. Bathrooms, women's bathroom off this side of the stage, men's bathroom down the hallway on the left on that side of the stage. There's also all gender bathrooms up one level here and up several levels there. Just ask me and I'll get you to those if you desire those. There's coffee and tea service on this side, caffeinated and decaf, and all sorts of tea. There's also water fountain there. There's also water service and several snacks. Please just help yourself, and when you find your plate empty and you need to graze, go and get some more. It'll be a delight for us. A few just brief comments about upcoming events with the Wisdom School, this being part of our Wisdom School program and is pretty much finishing out our program year. We were scheduled to have Padre Gotawama here on May 30th. His mother has fallen ill in Ireland, and he's going to be appropriately in Ireland instead. So he's been rebooked for Thursday, April 3rd next year. We'll certainly communicate that out, but if you had May 30th on your calendar already, you can release that and put April 3rd of next year on. We also have Debbie Thomas, who's going to be with us November 9th to engage the questions and experience of lament and hope. And we have lots more in the works that I'll be sharing in the coming weeks as we finalize the program year's plan for next year. We also have the exciting launch of the Center for Spirituality and Action, housed out of Leffler House here on the campus. It'll launch in the fall. There's been a planning group that has been working for several months now, laying the groundwork for that, and the invitation to join intentional community that will be engaged in prayer and contemplative practices. And out of that, the invitation to engage in action in God's name in the world. We'll have more about that across the summer, and if you're interested, I'm happy to talk with you about it. Today, we're delighted to have the Reverend Erin Jean Warde speaking with us on healing and the spiritual practices that lead to joy. She'll also be our preacher tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. and 11 a.m. services. We'll have a Friends Talking informal forum here at the 10 o'clock hour. And then she'll be with the 20s and 30s group tomorrow evening, talking more specifically about sober spirituality, which is the title of her book, Sober Spirituality, The Joy of Mindful Relationship with Alcohol. I have a few copies available for purchase, $13 payable to St. Mark's. If you want a copy, just see me at the back table. Erin is a 2012 graduate of a fine Episcopal seminary, the Seminary of the Southwest, who also happened to have another graduate just a few years earlier. She is a delightful priest who has served churches and the Episcopal Church in Texas and Oklahoma and her native Alabama, and now lives in Nashville, Tennessee. And if you don't get enough Southern drawl with me, get ready, because Erin's going to bring it today. Will you join me in welcoming the Reverend Erin Jean Warde?
morning. It's such a pleasure to be with you today. I do have one preface, which will be part of my introduction. I might sound a little less Southern than I usually do, because this is my first time ever being in the Pacific Northwest, like ever. And the trade-off of the beauty that you have in nature is that my allergies are reacting to the beauty that you have in nature. But I will tell you, it is worth it. It is worth every post-nasal drip in order to, first and foremost, be with you today, and also to take in the beauty of this place. I have a real spirituality of God in nature, and so being able to take in the presence of God, Spirit, and the wisdom that comes with that has already felt incredibly holy for me. I'm staying with a friend of mine, and her back deck looks out onto Mount Rainier. So in the morning, she will text me from the neighboring room and say, the mountain is out. And I'll get out and I'll go and I'll get my coffee and I'll go look at the mountain. So it has been really, really gorgeous. I went to see the Puget Sound, which is also really gorgeous. And what a blessed place for you to be in and to call your home. And yes, I am from the South. I typically say you can hear it when I talk, right? You already know where I'm from. And you might hear a couple of y'alls, but I think with your dean being from Arkansas, that won't be a culture shock for you. So born in Alabama, born and raised there, and actually in my college years, someone who went to seminary with Dean Steve was my sponsoring rector. I went through what the kids now are calling deconstruction. Before it was called deconstruction in college. At a faith in the Book of Common Prayer that was so beautiful and so expansive that it was second to the Bible, the best way I'd ever understood God. And as I read the Book of Common Prayer, I thought, that is a God that I believe in. So the Episcopal Church has been a real savior to me in that way through showing me God and Christ. And so I graduated from college, I went to seminary, and then I served in Waco, Texas, Dallas, Texas, and then I was a rector in Oklahoma. And when I was in Oklahoma, Ada, Oklahoma. Do you know Ada? Muskogee. Well, there's also a famous song about Muskogee that I won't sing for you today. Even when I'm not sick, I'm not a singer. So when I was in Oklahoma, I started to really discern my relationship with alcohol. And it had been a slow burn, as they say. I had started to just wonder, what is it that I seek out of this practice? How is it affecting me in mind, body, and soul? But there was a real gift in being in a rural community because it quieted a lot of the noise of the culture that always asked me to drink. Something that I always say is that for a very long time, people didn't ask me, do you want to spend time together? They said, want to grab a drink? That was the bid for connection, which was really hard for me to exist inside. And so in the quietude of a rural context, I got sober. I quit drinking. And I'm about 5.5 years sober now, and it has been the greatest spiritual awakening I've ever received in my life. And it's a profound gift. And I ended up leaving parish ministry to get trained as a recovery coach and work at a startup company focused on healthcare and recovery. And from there, started my own practice. So now I offer recovery coaching, spiritual direction, and the gift of what I get to do here today. And so that is really the core of my ministry. And something that I want to acknowledge is that in my recovery coaching practice, I have a lot of different types of people who are in different places in their relationship with alcohol. Some want to get sober. Some feel like it's become a coping mechanism and they want to remove it from coping, but they don't know about whether or not they never want to drink again. And that space was a space that wasn't held for me when I really needed it. There was a long period of time where I didn't know if I could quit drinking forever, but I knew I wanted to change my relationship with alcohol, and it felt very black and white. So in true Episcopal form, I'm trying to create a middle way for people who want to discern it and figure it out, but who don't necessarily know where that might lead. And so today, what I want us to do is talk more generally about coping, because coping mechanisms can certainly be alcohol. And I'm going to use some research around alcohol to kind of undergird the topic, and because I've spent a lot of time researching alcohol because I wrote a book around it. But I also want to acknowledge that as a sober person, I still have to figure out how to cope, right? This is not a thing that is done for me. It's not like, well, I'm sober, so I'm perfect. No, I still have to figure out how to cope. And so challenges in coping are just human, right? This is just what it means to be alive. And so I want us to talk about some of the challenges that are in front of us. And then also, I love to be practical, because as a seminary student and as a priest, I've gone to a lot of lectures that spend 4 hours telling me the problem, but never send me home with much that I can do about it to heal myself or others. And so I want us to have some really practical time together to think about how we can actually begin to change how we cope or enhance our already positive coping skills. And I also want to acknowledge that one of the gifts from what I know about the Wisdom School is that it is expansive in its spirituality, right? So there might be people here who identify as Christian. There might be people here who don't. And I'm grateful that we're here. And so I'm going to use some of my theology, but it is not meant to project that onto you. I'm a preacher, but I'm not preachy, or at least I try not to be. And so just know that any images that I offer that are really embedded in my faith are meant to be images to be received in your spirit in whatever way is most helpful for you. So please don't take that as if I'm trying to tell you what to believe, because I already deconstructed fundamentalism. We don't need to go back, right? So also, I just want to say, be gracious with yourself today. Be patient with yourself today. Things might hit you, right? We're going to talk about difficult topics. Also, we're all adults. If you need to go to the bathroom, go to the bathroom. Tea, food. We are going to take a 10-minute break at some point, because I would never subject you to 3 hours of me talking. And we're going to have some small groups to crowdsource some things. So just be free today, free to receive what we're doing here. And I encourage us toward that tenderness, because one of the first things I want to do is talk a little bit about destigmatizing. Topics around coping are highly stigmatized, right? One of my deals with God was that I would get sober under the condition that I never had to talk about it. God is not respecting my boundaries and has never respected my boundaries. But the reason I didn't want to talk about it is because we've so heavily stigmatized it. And the reality is that it should be something that is a gift, that is freedom, that is considered pure joy. And so one of the most important things we can do is destigmatize the realities of being alive, okay? And again, I'm going to use some research around alcohol, but just to undergird the point, because one of the most powerful pieces of research I did when I was looking into the toll that alcohol takes in the human life is that 3.3 million people die every year due to alcohol. 3.3 million people die every year due to alcohol, which is an incredibly sobering statistic, right? And what our society has done, I believe, is go out of its way to make sure that we believe that is a personal problem. This person has a problematic relationship with alcohol, right? They struggle, right? And I see this especially because of my history with drinking, right? That person has a drinking problem, is language that we hear about people. And that way of understanding it really exacerbates the isolation and the loneliness that is already so indicative of the challenge, right? Typically, a person struggling in their coping doesn't have a lot of support, right? They're already feeling lonely and isolated. So when we make sure that is a personal problem, we exacerbate those challenges. And the reality is that 3.3 million people don't die because of a personal problem, right? This is a cultural challenge, and it's much bigger than the individual. Now, we also have to take on the responsibility of being in relationship with our healing, right? But part of destigmatization is acknowledging that if you're a person who struggles with substances, with coping, you're in the majority, right? You are not alone in this. And there are a lot of other people around you, probably silently seeking that same care and community that you seek. An example that I'll use from my personal life in my coping now is social media. I was trapped in my apartment for 2 years. I live alone, and I love all my cats. But at some point, you need some human beings. And with COVID, I did not have human beings, but I could access people on my phone, right? I could scroll all day because that was like the only way I felt like I could have any connection. And yet we're no longer in that context. I'm here with you right now in person, thank God, but I still hold on to that, right? I still have that challenge. And the thing is, all of these apps were designed to be addictive. Really, really insightful work can be done if you look into the research, because a lot of the people that created algorithms are now speaking out saying, I regret that I ever made that, because what we did is we researched human psychology and we figured out how to prey on you. So remembering that that is not your fault, right? These things are created to be addictive. And so acknowledging that and saying, this is not something that is all on me. There are factors at play that are outside of my control, and there are factors inside my control. How do I acknowledge what is outside of my control and then work on what is inside my control? Also, I don't know if you read the news, but my news feed is just like a curated list of stressors and prayer requests. I mean, it is a really dismal state right now for me personally. Maybe my algorithm wants me to be depressed. I don't know. But it's really rough out there, right? And so all of those things become things I have to cope with. Also, none of those things involve my personal life, right? It's not just violence and war and devastation in the world. It's not just climate challenges that deeply grieve me. It's also that my friends are struggling. I have struggles in my own life. And all of these things become the realities that we as human beings have to cope with, right? And coping is not wrong. Coping is human. If you're alive, you're coping in some way, shape, or form, right? And that I think about a lot, if you want to know how rough the pandemic was, I was able to quit my full-time job and go into private practice because there were so many people struggling that I had people asking me, would you please work with me in a one-on-one capacity, right? And something that I like to share as an image of what we were up against is, during the pandemic, couldn't go to the gym, couldn't see your friends. Most of the positive coping mechanisms that we would have turned to were shut off from us. But Instacart could put a 6-pack of wine on your front door safely, right? And that's not your fault. Many of us were doing the best we could with the tools that were at our disposal, right? I was scrolling my butt off because it was the tool I had at my disposal in order to not go crazy during a really crazy time, right? And yet, we have this balance of coping is not wrong, coping is human, and also, how can I work on my coping so that it becomes something that might actually heal the pains that I'm facing in my life. So we're not demonizing coping, but we're asking, is this way of coping helping me heal? And if not, how can I begin to cope in a way that really cares for me? Because the scrolling doesn't care for me. And I know I want to do a little better, right? And there's research that I really appreciate from Brene Brown when she talks about guilt versus shame. This is the big preface. If you were raised Roman Catholic, we're using guilt in a different context here. I always say that because she has her own research. So we're going to use these terms within the context of Brene Brown's research. And the way that she describes it, she says that guilt is I did something bad. Shame is I am bad. It's an identity marker versus an action. She writes that guilt is just as powerful as shame, but its influence is positive, while shame's is destructive. In fact, in my research, I found that shame corrodes the very part of us that believes we can change and do better. Brene Brown says that shame needs three things to grow. It needs secrecy, silence, and judgment. If you put that in a petri dish with shame, it'll triple, it'll quadruple, right? So let's imagine a scenario where I don't love the way I'm coping. Well, secrecy, I'm not going to tell anyone because this is a personal problem, remember? Silence, I'm not going to reach out for support or ask for help because I'm ashamed of it, right? I don't want to tell anyone my drinking has gotten out of hand, or I don't want to tell anyone I have some other challenge going on. And the judgment, well, my self-talk is probably pretty cruel, right? Because I don't love myself right now. I'm telling myself, you better just fix it, quit being such a whatever, right? My self-talk is typically not going well. So in that context, our shame is just going to multiply. And then we're so overwhelmed by our shame that all of the normal stressors of our day-to-day life act on us. And the end of the day comes, and I have no capacity to cope any differently, right? So I'm going to go back to my old haunts because I don't have any energy to pick up a new hobby or go do something else. And so I'm just going to rinse and repeat. And that ends up being the cycle of shame that happens with those coping mechanisms that we don't love. Addictive habits or maladaptive habits. And something that I think is really, really powerful and important to remember is that Brene Brown writes that shame is highly correlated with addiction, violence, aggression, depression, eating disorders, and bullying. Yeah, she later also notes that shame is correlated with suicidality. Because what shame does is it says you're the problem. If the problem is something I've done, I have passageways into changing, right? That's guilt. If the problem is me, I'm retreating inside of myself, I'm isolated. And so all of these ways of self-harm and negativity are going to be what kind of rules the roost in that situation. But there's hope in guilt in the way that she defines it. She writes that when we apologize for something we've done, make amends, or change a behavior that doesn't align with our values, guilt, not shame, is most often the driving force. And we know this spiritually, right? Most religions have some passageway into forgiveness and reconciliation. We certainly have rite of reconciliation of the penitent and confession in the Episcopal Church. AA's process of amends. This is the action of getting back into right relationship with ourselves and others, right? We know in these rituals the positive way that guilt can work on our hearts and in our lives. And this reconciliation that we receive through these rituals ends up being freedom from secrecy, silence, and judgment. right? I'm confessing this to someone, so it's not secret. I'm seeking out support, so it's not silent. And I'm receiving absolution, which is erasing that judgment and that self-talk, right? So these are the passageways into us beginning to change that behavior and move toward our wholeheartedness. And to do this, we have to start from a place of self-compassion. Something that I think about all the time. And I was talking to some of you earlier about this because there are some people here who are also in recovery. I had a very non-linear road into sobriety. I would do the thing where I would like wake up hungover and be like, I'm never gonna drink again. And then by 4 o'clock, when someone said, do you want to go out for a drink? I would be like, sure, let's do it, right? And so I had this really like non-linear movement in, but one of the things I kept trying to do was hate myself healthy. If I'm mean enough to myself, I'll certainly quit doing this. And it never worked. The only way I was ever able to quit drinking was to begin to love myself. And as far as I'm concerned, that was the inbreaking of the love of God in my life, right? To believe that I was actually worthy of a life full of joy, right? And even when I say that now, the idea of hating myself healthy, it's obviously not how it works, right? Self-compassion has to be the beginning point because it begins to undo those voices of shame that we know hold us in destruction. I about this, and it's so trite in a way, but I always fly to these events and you hear, put your mask on first, right? Because if something happens and you pass out, you can't help your child, you know? And so this idea of putting our mask on first so that we're then able to help other people and also be well. And this self-compassion, it helps us usher in a new way. And I think it especially acts as an antidote to that idea that it's a personal problem, right? We're no longer feeling isolated because we're feeling beloved. And it's really important to remember that we are beloved. To use Brené Brown's research, she writes that self-compassion is vitally important because shame is a social concept. It happens between people, and it also heals best between people. A social wound needs a social balm. Self-compassion is key because when we're able to be gentle with ourselves in the midst of shame, we're more likely to reach out, connect, and experience empathy. So practice self-compassion because that's the starting place of it becoming compassion for all people, right? When we struggle, we have more compassion for people who struggle, right? Because we can say, I see you, I know you. Brené Brown says that empathy is the antidote to shame because shame is secrecy, silence, and judgment. And empathy is, I'm receiving your story. You're not alone. I struggle too. This is not a personal problem. So the antidote to this loneliness and this suffering and silence can become healing in community. So as we think about these positive ways to heal ourselves, remember, if anything, this is guilt work today, right? This is positive movement forward. And this is a source of hope, right? We're going to think about positive ways to cope, which is a really, really good thing. And we know that this way of caring for ourselves puts our mask on first so that we are then able to care for others. I also want to note that this is not perfectionist work. I'm a recovering perfectionist as well. I won't list all the things I'm recovering from because that feels a little vulnerable, but let's just say I have a couple, right? But I also want to say, like, I know what it feels like because of my nonlinear relationship with sobriety. I know what it feels like to be like really working on my recovery and have a slip up and how that can feel so hard, right? Every single time when I was trying to hate myself healthy, when I would drink again, I was like, you're a failure, right? Like, you're just like, why are you even trying? We're really, really rough self-talk. And yet that shame is only going to send us back to where we don't want to go, right? And so something I talk to my clients about is, if you slip up, how can you care for yourself? Because what I'm trying to do is get us out of that shame cycle, because that shame cycle is always going to send you to where you don't want to be. And so remembering that even when you slip up, remembering that you're beloved and that you're worthy of self-compassion, no matter what happens to you in your life, is actually the beginning point of our healing. And it's really, really important. With that said, we've spent some time talking about the challenge and the root of self-compassion that I want us to build. And so I want us to think now about what some positive coping mechanisms are, or how to pivot toward that. And I call this the power of the pause, which I will explain. So we have an epidemic level of loneliness in our culture right now. That's another study that I won't bore you with, but loneliness is right up there with alcohol, pandemic. It's up in one of those real social ills that we're facing right now. And another part of that, I think, is that we're in a fast-paced culture. So there was a study done, and I shouldn't even be quoting it because I can't pull it up right now, but it was an article about how one of the most common responses to how are you is I'm busy, which read me for filth, because how many times are people like, how are you? And I'm like, I'm busy, which is true. And also, what is that saying about us? That, the response is not anything else about our lives. It's just that we're busy. So we live in the culture of busy, right? And that's going to lead us into tons and tons of burnout. And the way that we cope is directly correlated to burnout, right? Because when you're coping in a way that doesn't heal you, it's exacerbating that burnout. It's not actually helping you feel restored, right? So 2 hours scrolling on my phone versus 2 hours going on a hike with my friends, it's not shocking which one is actually going to restore me, right? So burnout means that we typically don't seek the support that we need because, again, we feel like we're just full, we're at capacity. So the idea of doing more feels impossible. So the first step, if we want to start changing how we cope, is just to pause. Because we're in such a fast-paced culture that figuring out how do we slow down just a little bit to actually make a choice about how we want to cope, right? So how do we become mindful versus the very common experience that I also had, which was work is over, I've cracked open a bottle of wine, right? Work is over, I'm on the sofa scrolling, right? That is typically a lacking mindfulness, right? It's just our modus operandi. And so how do we start to prioritize rest so that we are not so burned out? And when I think about pausing, it may not surprise you that the number one model I look toward is Jesus. So something I love about the ministry of Jesus is that if you read the Gospels, so many of the healing moments in the Gospels are interruptions. Jesus and his disciples are walking, they're on the way, and someone stops them, right? Someone tugs at the hem of his cloak or says, aren't you the Son of God? This also feels very offensive to me as someone who doesn't like to be interrupted. I would much appreciate it if Jesus was different, if I can be honest. But the great thing about Jesus is that he allowed himself to be interrupted, and he had these moments with these people that genuinely changed the entirety of their lives, right? People left healed, they left seen, and they felt different and loved, so much so that they left to go tell everyone about this incredible thing that happened to them, right? And also, and this is important, Jesus went to a mountaintop to pray. There are multiple places in the Gospels where Jesus says, see y'all, I'm going to go rest. I'm going to go up there and I'm going to make sure I have this balance between mission and rest. And so we can even look to Jesus to say, we're also worthy of having a balance of mission and rest. that if we are striving to be Christ-like, we get to allow ourselves to be interrupted in our mission, to care for people in front of us, and also to go to our mountaintops to pray. And I think some of this hustle culture is that we've lost that balance, right? We've lost the ability to do both. And so if you hear nothing else, I want you to be able to hear today that you are worthy of care. You are worthy of the pause. You're worthy of rest. Because belovedness is your birthright. Belovedness is your birthright. I believe we were created in the image of divinity, and that divinity looked upon us at our creation and knew everything about us, literally everything about us, past, present, and future, and still looked at us and said, "You are good." And that's how we were sent into the world. And that we've lost that remembrance that we were born into belovedness and that we retain belovedness through the love of God. And so certainly we can care for ourselves, right? We can return to that hub of belovedness. But how do we do that, right? That's a very philosophical thought. And so, as I said, I want to get practical. So, I regret to inform you that the first step is to feel your feelings. I say this as someone who tried every other option, okay? And that is back to. And the challenge about feeling your feelings is that it feels huge, right? Like, I'll pass. I'm busy. I can't do that, you know? So I understand that it feels like a lot, but we're going to talk about ways that it becomes a little bit better. So a revolutionary piece of neuroscience that I love comes from Dr. Jill Bolt Taylor. And she found, she's a Harvard brain scientist, neuroscientist. And she found that 90 seconds is the amount of time it takes for your brain to receive a stimuli of a feeling and begin to process it. 90 seconds, right? So it takes about 90 seconds to feel a feeling. So if we're going to try to start feeling our feelings, one thing that's really important to remember is that it isn't as big as it feels when we are told we have to do that, right? When we're numbing, which is where a lot of our maladaptive coping mechanisms come, we're looking for the quick release, right? And I totally understand that. But something really important to remember is that we can actually turn to positive coping mechanisms and also experience a pretty quick release, right? So one thing I do, after I learned that piece of wisdom, if I have a moment where I feel, do you know when a feeling just like hits you in the chest, but you don't really know what's going on exactly? You're just like, I don't know what just happened, but I sure don't like it. When I have that feeling, I set a timer for 1 minute, 30 seconds. And I sit. I just sit, try to do some deep breathing, and I just feel that feeling. Because the thing is, I can typically find 1 minute, 30 seconds in my day, right? If you told me I needed to spend 30 minutes, well, I have a call coming up soon, so I'm probably not going to do that. I'm busy, right? But 1 minute, 30 seconds, I can typically find. And what happens in that 1 minute, 30 seconds, the circumstances don't change, right? I still have to address whatever is going on. But what happens is I typically locate what's going on, right? So an example would be, how many times have we gotten an email that triggers us, right? Like, and you just have this gut reaction of like, again, I don't know what's happening, but I don't like it, right? So I stop and I'll sit and I'll think, oh, I feel belittled. Okay, well, now I know what's going on with me emotionally. Or this was just offensive. Like someone just said something that people should not say to other people, and I'm angry. And so when I know what the emotion is, then I can begin to care for it, right? So if someone belittles me, I might call a friend of mine and say, can you just tell me that I'm like decent at my life? Like, just please help me. Like, this person like really belittled me. Or, if I'm angry, I might need to take a quick walk. Like, I might need to get some air. I think that the 90 seconds is the difference between like popping an email back and being Christ-like, which I think I struggle with those two things. Whoops among us has not popped an email back and then regretted that later. The pause helps me to respond in a way that is within my integrity, which is sometimes saying, hey, what you said made me feel belittled. And I don't know if you meant that, but that's how it felt. And I've had some moments where I've said that and our relationship has gotten stronger because they could say, I did not mean that. I didn't realize that language. It was poorly chosen. So sometimes like pausing and responding and being honest about how you feel can actually build a relationship, as opposed to, I like to say that English is my second language because passive aggression is my first. Because I'm Southern and I feel like I was taught that first. So like I can send back a very cutting passive aggressive email, but that's never going to build a relationship. It's not going to mean that we work better together. It's not going to mean that I've showed you love, and it's not going to heal the pain that I feel is being caused through this situation, right? So 90 seconds just helps us respond in a way that might actually lead us into deeper relationship and healing. The other example that I would give, so years ago, I had a feeling, and I will say I knew what the feeling was, but that didn't mean I handled it any better. So I was sober, but I still have struggles in coping. And so I was like, whatever, I'm just gonna like binge Netflix, eat a bunch of sweets, scroll. Did it all day Saturday. Oh no, it was all day Friday. Woke up Saturday, rinse and repeat. Like I was just like in it. I was just like letting this feeling ruin me. And it felt like a shroud over me. Do you know what I mean? When you have a feeling that just like sits in your stomach and you almost feel nauseous about it. So it was just hanging over me. And Saturday night, I was like, whatever, I guess I'll meditate. But I was like not happy about it. I was not happy about it. But I was like, I'm going to use a positive coping mechanism because I feel like I should. And so I sat and I used this app called Insight Timer, which is a really great app. I see some people nodding. And you can like search an issue and it'll pop up some meditation. So I knew what the challenge was, searched it, found the shortest one I could find. And it was 7 minutes. And I turned it on and I sat there and I did this full guided meditation for 7 minutes. And when it finished, the feeling left my stomach. It passed, right? All it needed was 7 minutes. And all I could think of is that I wasted 48 hours and I could have let it pass in 7 minutes. I wasted my whole weekend shrouded in this feeling. And it really instilled in me that it's good to turn to these positive coping mechanisms because there's a world in which I would have addressed it and had a better weekend instead of wallowing in it. So when feeling your feelings feels impossible, which I relate with, what if we started with 90-second timers and 7-minute meditations, right? Because that feels possible for me in a way that some other ways of thinking about it don't. So I want to then think about the fact that, we've acknowledged the challenges around us. How are we doing on time? We've acknowledged the challenges around us. We've started to pause and we're feeling our feelings, right? But one of the most important parts of this healing journey is not just removing things from our lives, but also how we then fill that space, right? So pausing kind of creates this vacuum, and it matters how we fill it. And so that becomes how we cope differently, right? And I want to talk about creativity, play, rest, because those are some of the most powerful ways that we can fill that gap and receive some real healing. And I believe that we are beautifully and uniquely made such that we have this capacity gifted to us for creativity and wonder. And I believe that in our creativity, we connect with the creativity of the divine, right? One of the reasons I love nature is because I feel like it's just where God showed off. It's just where God was like, what if I just give you beauty? God, I think, knows, we need water, we need food, we need these things to survive. But also, God didn't create robots. God created people with capacity for joy. And then God gave us opportunities to behold it, right? To receive the creativity of God and to participate in that divinity through our own creative acts. And so I think of creativity as a thin space. If you know what creativity or what a thin space is, it's that space where the lines between divinity and humanity are quite thin, right? So creativity becomes a really beautiful tool for us. And if we look at creativity and if we look at, scripture around creativity, one of the really cool things about Genesis is that it is creativity. But then I always think about God creating all the animals. And I mean, that had to just be full of play, right? Like if you've ever seen baby animal videos, that's how I'm picturing God creating, just like tons of baby animals, like the cutest, most adorable thing you've ever seen in your life, right? Which is purely for the sport of it, as the Psalms tell us, right? Purely just God delighting in creation. And within that same narrative, within that same arc, God rests. So what scripture points out to us is that creativity, play, and rest are wed. That that is the activity of divinity. And so it can also be the activity that we participate in to participate in the gift of divinity. And so in Christianity and in Judaism, we receive not only these images of creation, but creativity and also rest and play. And so we receive the word that belovedness is your birthright. And I think that when we rest and we play and we are creative, we slow down long enough to remember our belovedness. Because the culture says stay busy, right? Make sure you do all your emails, right? That's sort of the push. But Sabbath, rest, play, creativity, we're able to slow down, to pause, and to remember that belovedness is our birthright. And that's why that becomes such a powerful healing tool for us, because it brings us back to that root of self-compassion. And so I want us to think about creativity, play, and rest. One of the things that I want to acknowledge is that this is kind of obvious, but I'll just say, I think these are spiritual practices, right? As a spiritual director, a lot of people will kind of ask me, how do I pray? Like, it's a very common question of like, am I praying right? And I'm a priest and I struggle with that. I'm like, does this count? And that's my own weirdness, right? But I think we do struggle with like what counts as prayer? What do I need to do to make sure I'm praying enough? And I think being able to acknowledge that we can really consecrate these times of creativity, play, and rest, offer them to God, right? I used to go, when I first got sober, walking was huge for me. I would wake up every morning. There was a beautiful park by my house, and I would do about a 5K every morning. And I just, rain, shine, sleet, or snow, I was obsessed with it. And I would just sit in my car before I got out, and I would just say, God, be with me. God, be lockstep with me, right? And I wouldn't be actively praying the whole time, but I would envision myself walking with God. And so often my prayers are petitions, right? Hey, God, just wanted to check in and ask you if you could do something for me real quick, right? And so it was really important for me to have some prayer practices that were just be with me, right? Just let me be in your presence and please be in mine. And so taking some of these things and consecrating them and asking God to be with us in them and acknowledging that they are spiritual practices of life for us. Some research that I've really loved in my work comes from Dr. Stuart Brown. He is a psychiatrist, a clinical researcher, and the founder of the National Institute for Play. And what Brown found is that play shapes our brain. It helps us foster empathy. It helps us navigate complex social groups, and it's at the core of how we understand creativity and innovation. The quote from Dr. Brown that really stuck out to me is that in his research, he found that the opposite of play is not work. The opposite of play is depression. The opposite of play is not work. The opposite of play is depression. He wrote that play helps us deal with difficulties, provides a sense of expansiveness. It promotes mastery of our craft and is an essential part of the creative process. So I'm not a therapist, and I won't pretend to be one today. I am a person who needs a therapist, but that's an aside. But when I think of this idea of depression, I think we can understand it not necessarily as clinical depression, but as the cultural depression that we're facing right now. When I talk about this loneliness that's at an epidemic level, because of the fact that we live differently now, you know, our devices make us a little isolated, right? I can sort of stay at home a little bit more. I work full-time from home. I do all my work on Zoom. I can have a really full work day in which I don't spend any time in another room with a human being, right? And there is a gift to that, and there's also the challenges of that. And so I'm deeply grateful for that, and also I'm really grateful I get to be here today, because y'all are like here. It's incredible. And so I think this depression that is the opposite of play is also not an individual challenge. I think a lot of us struggle with like hobbies and doing things that feel generative and interesting to us. Some people don't, and that's amazing. Teach me your ways. But I see that, right? So I see that in my spiritual directees. I see that in my recovery coaching clients. I see that in myself. And so play, creativity, and rest are these spiritual passageways given to us that can help us navigate this cultural depression that I think we find ourselves in, as well as the pain, stressors, and realities that we have to cope with in our day-to-day lives. And so I also just want to acknowledge that I still struggle with this. So it's important to me to speak to you as someone who I have not figured this out. I am also working on this. I'm also trying to get my own hobbies and do better. So we're in this together, right? Also, I won't bore you with the research, but another point of research is that creativity is declining. So they've started doing work on that, and people are just less creative. And I think it's because we spend so much of our capacity just trying to keep a roof over our head, just trying to love our kids or our family. And so we've lost a culture that understands rest, right? And so, of course, if we don't feel like we have free time, we don't feel like we have the time to devote to these spiritual practices. And we have a lot of reasons why we might be in this space of cultural depression, right? To go back to what we talked about earlier, I mean, COVID ravaged a lot of people. I don't think we've done the work to understand the toll it really took on mental health. I still think we're too close to it to know. And I saw a lot of it up close as a recovery coach, and yet I still don't think we know the full toll that it took on us. And in addition to COVID, we were all living our lives, right? People were still parenting. People still had jobs, right? All of those stressors were still present. And yet, where there is hope, right? We can begin to try to create this capacity for hope and for joyful ways to care for ourselves. With that said, I want to also acknowledge that similar to feeling my feelings, creativity feels really big, right? Like if someone's just like, go be creative. I'm like, what? I'm going to go scroll. Thank you very much. That feels impossible. And I think also this is a little bit of a diatribe But I also think we've thought of creativity as a side hustle, right? So my creativity can't just be creativity. I need to sell it on Etsy, right? I need to make a little bit of profit. Why would I spend any amount of time doing anything that won't bring a little money back? And so sometimes I say to people, like, just do something and then immediately throw it away. Immediately throw it away. Color something and then immediately throw it away to remind yourself that the purpose was the act, right? That we don't have to, frame it. Also, if perfectionism is one of your challenges, just remember that when a child walks up to their parent with what they scribbled in class, the parent typically doesn't say, you actually missed the lines, and the actual colors of an owl don't include purple. So if you could just work on that, that would be great. No, a parent typically puts it on the refrigerator because it is gift, right? It's just gift. And it's beauty to be creative. And so remembering that sometimes that inner child work of saying, maybe what I do gets to be loved the way it's loved if I took it to my parent, right? Or maybe it just needs to be scribbled and thrown away. Also, one of the challenges that I see in our coping is that choice, we have brain fatigue, right? So typically by the end of the day, you've made a lot of decisions, okay? And I actually talk about this a lot with my clients who are in recovery. Something that we know about recovery is that it's literally neuroscience, right? We're actually changing neural pathways in the human brain. So neuroplasticity became like a weird hobby of mine when I got sober because I couldn't believe the gift of the human brain and that it has the ability to change. And so we have this gift of changing the brain, and yet decision fatigue is a real thing, right? So like laying out your outfit before you wake up in the morning is one less decision you have to make, right? Sometimes I talk with my people about, it may not be forever, but maybe you need a couple meal kits just so you're not dealing with the fatigue of walking through the grocery store, anything to take some of the work off your brain, especially because, I don't even want to talk about how many emails I power through every day, which are beautiful opportunities for connection, but they're all decisions I'm making or ways that I'm being fatigued. And then what happens is that social media doesn't make me choose, right? Scrolling doesn't make me choose. They just show me a new video every 1 minute or whatever, I don't have to think. So it feels easier. And so by doing some work on removing that fatigue, it can help create the capacity for us to be able to make a choice at the end of the day to say, I really want to do something else. The same thing is true for the fact that, we rewatch shows, right? Like I will watch Parks and Rec, I have these shows that I just always have on because they're easy. There's no choice involved in that, right? And so just thinking about these little ways are things that feel little, but they're actually quite big, that help us to begin to create that capacity at the end of a long day to choose something a little more generative. I also want to say, we're not demonizing being on your phone, right? We're not demonizing watching Netflix. I had to make a really big rule for myself when I got sober, which was success is you do not drink, period. You can do anything else. You can scroll all day, you can eat whatever you want, you just can't drink, right? And so being really generous with ourselves and not then deciding we're going to nitpick through every single part of our lives, right? But the question is, like, even with social media or even with streaming, is there a moderation, right? There's a vast difference to me between, and this is just in myself, when I really, really want to see a movie, like it's about to come out and it's finally out and I watch it, versus me putting on background music or background TV, right? I'm just going to watch like the 87,000th episode of Law and Order, right? instead of something that I've really been excited about, right? It's the same tool, but one is exciting and generative, and it's a story or a documentary I'm really excited about versus I just want to get out of my head, right? I just want to numb out. So what we're trying to do is acknowledge what are small, creative, and playful, joyous practices. And even though it's not exactly the same, can you set your timer for 90 seconds and dance, right? Can you set your timer for 90 seconds and listen to some really upbeat, fun music? Can you set your timer for 7 seconds or 7 minutes and doodle, right? There's actually neuroscience around doodling being really good for you. And then I would add, make sure you throw it in the trash or make sure you don't think of it as Etsy, which there's nothing wrong with selling things on Etsy, but I want to some of that perfectionism that will become a barrier often to us doing anything. And all of this creativity that we're trying to engender, as you'll remember, is wed to rest. I think, why don't we take a 10-minute break and then we'll come back because I've been talking a lot. Does that sound good to everyone? Okay. 10-minute break and then we'll come back for rest and small groups and other things. So as an extrovert, I hate to cut down all of our conversations. Before we barrel forward into my rambling, are there any, we're going to have time at the end to like process and talk through things, but has there been anything up to now that you wanted to reflect on that has stuck out to you? Anything that could use some further exploration? Yes. Oh, wait, do we need our microphone? I can repeat. Okay.
Emily. Hi, Erin. I'm Emily. It's nice to meet you in person. Yeah. Yes. Yes. When you were sharing about your like weekend experience of like the Friday, Saturday, horrible days, and you had the meditation, and then you realized that you had wasted all of that time, I was just wondering if you have some strategies that help you not to get stuck in the wasted time, like, oh my gosh, I just wasted all this time. And so then you have this other cycle of shame that comes through because you wasted that time in a way that didn't feel energizing.
That's a fantastic question. So how do we not get stuck in the, dare I say, shame of not turning to our tools quickly, right? Something that I try to focus on is, it's kind of like the Buddhist way of acknowledging that everything is my teacher. So through that experience, what I learned is the gift of turning to my tools. And so even though that was a difficult 2 days for me, it has created almost a reflex for saying, no, we get our meditation out. We go for a walk, we call a friend, because I don't want that to happen again. So that way of trying to transform that into being a gift for me, that it really showed me also the power of the tool. Sometimes I do think part of this is fake it till you make it, just keep doing the thing, sometimes it becomes habit, and it's sort of like church, you're not always going to maybe have this transcendent experience that feels like Jesus Christ himself walked out and kissed you on the forehead. But we keep going, right? We're faithful. We keep showing up to the church. We keep showing up to our practices. But having that moment of saying, oh no, this worked. Like this was a balm to me. And then it allowed me to have a beautiful Sunday, right? So I could have kept putting it off, and it could have been even longer. It could have been 4 days. It could have been 5 days. So the gift of catching it and then giving myself credit for turning to my tools at all. Like, I think I've spent years of my life not turning to my tools. And so doing some of that reframe work to help you get out of that stuckness and into the gift of the practice. Is that helpful? And I can walk it around too if you want.
So my question comes even before that. And that is when you're have an awareness that you have an addictive response to life, and still resist. And then I was waiting, and you said take a pause. Okay, so I even know that tool of taking a pause, but I would love for you to elaborate a little bit more on that leap. It seems like a huge leap from the knowledge and then the rationalization. Well, it's really not that bad. So I'm not going to acknowledge. I mean, that's the place where I get stuck.
I think one of the things you're talking about is cognitive dissonance, which is, yeah, I have a whole section about it in my book because I was talking to someone here about how, not everyone has what we would call like a rock bottom experience. And there were times in my life that I kind of wish I'd had a rock bottom because instead I was able to do a lot of justification, right? Well, I've never had blank happen. Ergo, probably not that bad. Also, when you're in cultures where, there were times in my life where my drinking was toxic, but it was also just like everyone else, right? And so it wasn't as if I was the outlier. I was actually pretty lockstep with other people, but I also knew that it was toxic and it was not helping me. And so what do you do? Because then you can normalize your behavior, which I did for many years of like, we're all drinking this way. And they're a good person. I'm a good person. We're all good people, right? And so for me, trying to shift it away from other people and bringing it home to, but how do I feel? Like, what is my mind, body, and soul state? And then acknowledging that I don't have to judge other people. They can do whatever they want to do, but I seek something. And I can seek that inside of myself, inside of my own practices, and not worry about other people. But I think what you're talking about is something that I address a lot in coaching, which is this cognitive dissonance. And so what I encourage people to do is to write out what you hope for yourself. So one of the big experiences, the actual experience that pivoted me out of back and forth and into sobriety is that I had two very different challenges in my life. One was that I was kind of discerning sobriety. I didn't really know how I felt about alcohol. And I also was not very happy. And they were very separate things, right? And so one day I'm a list maker, like I just love a list. And yeah, are you a list person? And so I got my notebook out and I said, I'm just gonna write out everything I desire in life. And I'm gonna kind of write out what I would consider to be pie in the sky things that I hope for me. And I wrote out, love my body and be in a healthy relationship, write a book, right? Like I wrote out all of these things. And then I looked at it, I pulled back and I looked at it. And in the way that the Holy Spirit talks to me, I had this moment where I looked at it and I said, uh-oh, I think this is possible for me on the other side of sobriety. Uh-oh. I think these two very different things are not very different at all. I think that my joy can be unlocked through releasing this numbing, right? And so I say all of that to say that when I start to go into comparison mode or justification mode or all of those sorts of things, to come back and ask myself, well, what do I desire for my life? And how can I live my life in a way that stands a chance at leading me into my hopes? What are the ways I can act that might actually bring me profound joy? And what that helps me do is not worry about other people, because we can also go into judgment, right? Like I've seen people, and I'm not, it happens, but like there can be some sort of I'm sober now judgment of other people, right? And I don't think that's helpful either, right? Shame exacerbates challenges. And so shaming anyone is not going to help them in whatever challenge they're facing. And so for me to come back to the center of my own desires for myself, and then to pray for those other people, you know, commit them to divinity, to God, wisdom, whatever is your preference. Is that helpful? I know that's kind of around the question, but. Yeah.
Betsy, I'm going to give you the microphone.
Oh.
And
I say,
so that
I
you
say,
are-
I say that what you're really saying is that we need to pay attention. I need to pay attention to myself. If I have any question about what I'm about to do, take a minute and think about it
Yes.
to check in for what's the motivation? Yeah.
Well, and acknowledging that some of the comparisons we do are just wildly irrelevant. Like, why does it matter what someone does? If that exact same thing is harmful to me, period, that's all I need to know. You know, I wouldn't go up to a person who has celiac and say, well, I can eat a loaf of bread. No, it's very harmful to them, right? So like that comparing the way we digest bread is very different because we're different people and we have different ways of being in relationship with things. And so saying the way other people drink, use social media, use substances, you know, I can't fix other people. That's not my role. I can care for other people, but the comparison elements that I would use, they're just irrelevant. What matters is this doesn't make me feel good. Doesn't make me feel good in mind, body, and soul. And my hope for my life is to be really defined by joy. And so what am I going to do to act in a way that will lead me into that joy? Fantastic question. I appreciate that. Anything else before we dive back into rest and small groups? Oh, great.
Hi, I'm Catherine. It's so nice to be here today, also from Texas, so another suburb, Dallas. so-
Okay, I lived in Dallas for 3 years.
Yeah, yeah. My question is about the other side of this work. So this is work, I think a lot of us, just because it's actually a pretty, present in our culture is mindfulness and, in one way or another facing what's going, the traumas that we have. But on the other side of feeling your feelings and processing your emotions, a lot of times there's situations that aren't changing. And it's whether it be in the world or whether it be in our family systems, like a lot of things that are that require a level of acceptance that is difficult and deeply, it is that. I wonder what you would say about the process of acceptance once we've gone through the work of, working on our triggers and working on healing and all of that. Like, what does acceptance of just bigger things beyond our own control really look like? And I hope maybe we'll be getting to this later is the permission to still be joyful people.
Yeah. I mean, the first thing I would say, so I do have a chapter about alcohol and trauma and the way that, because what you're hitting on is really important because there are things inside of our control and there are things outside of our control. One of the things I know about me is that trauma really exacerbated my relationship with alcohol. So I was a pretty social drinker. And then, I have childhood trauma, but I also had some adult trauma that happened when I was already a drinking person. And so, like going home became a trigger for me. And so then it's really hard because just like going home after the end of a long day is actually what triggers you to cope. Also, stimuli shift. So you can move to a whole different place, but the cue becomes not defined by place and more by act, right? So trauma is a really complex reality, and anyone who's experienced trauma, it's a lifelong reality that we're coping with. And so I really appreciate Buddhist thought. I'm a very devout Christian, and I also think a lot of the things that show up in Buddhism are very applicable to what Jesus taught. And so looking at the idea of sitting with. I think that the challenge that we face when we numb is that we don't address it, right? So in a much smaller way, the way I was coping and not doing my meditations, I wasn't surfacing the reality to then let it breathe and let it pass. So it hung over me. And so the reality of just having moments where even when it's my trauma, if I shove the trauma down, it's just still going to be there, right? So letting it breathe, letting it surface, caring for it, honoring things like it's not my fault, right? This isn't something I did to myself. This is a reality of life. And also then sort of releasing it in the ways I can and letting that be a consistent practice, right? I think a lot about meditation and how, meditation is not thinking. It is when things show up, we address them and then we let them pass, and how that becomes a practice for dealing with trauma on the whole. I also say that as someone who is not a therapist, but I'm trained in trauma-informed care. So I have a lot of sensitivity to trauma in my coaching and in my spiritual direction. The other comment you made about joy, I think I don't address it explicitly, but one of the things I've been talking about is like joy is a spiritual practice, right? And one of the things that Brene Brown says is that we have what's called foreboding joy, which is something I talk about all the time because it's something I do and it's something I address a lot with my people. And it's this idea that we dress rehearse tragedy, right? So something good is happening in your life. And so you start to like imagine the bad, right? She talks about looking at her baby in a crib and imagining her baby dying and thinking, why am I doing this? And it's because we're afraid of joy. Because joy is powerful and it's big and it's beautiful, and it can sometimes be the most scary part, right? So we want to actually rationalize that and we want to prepare for the worst, right? I'm an Enneagram 6, so we just live our whole lives preparing for the worst. And what she says that I think is really important to your question is that when we have these moments of joy, it's actually really important to receive the gift of that, because that will be what sustains us when tragedy strikes. We don't have to dress rehearse tragedy. It's a real part of our lives. It will happen to us, right? In some way, shape, or form. So allowing ourselves to feel joy, knowing that that will be what sustains us when we are in the inevitabilities of life that are so hard for us. And on the practical level, she talks about permission slips, which I think are really, really helpful. I'll talk about this when we talk about some of our coping tools, but basically like getting out a Post-it note and saying, I give myself permission to blank, right? So a permission slip that I would have written for myself today is I give myself permission to pause and get a cough drop because I have allergies. Like, this is really helpful for me. Or, sometimes I'll hear people say, right, I give myself permission to cry. If I start to feel tender about something, I'm not going to bottle it and put on a brave face. I'm going to give myself permission to cry over that, right? So it's this really conscious way of saying I'm allowed to feel that. And so maybe a permission slip would be, I give myself permission to receive the joy from this. Also moving us out of comparative suffering. I think comparative suffering is when we say, well, I might be going through a divorce, but there's starving children in Africa. That's actually not helping the starving children in Africa. And it also is negating the reality of the pain of your life, right? You're allowed to struggle, and other people are going to have their struggles. And one of the most powerful things we can do to help ourselves and others is to honor that pain so that we are well enough to then try to help starving children in Africa, right? How do those things become concrete? Ways that we actually act on it rather than I'm just going to suppress all my pain and act like it's not real. You get to have challenges, and then we also hold them in tension with the reality of the world's challenges, right? Is that helpful? Okay, want to check. Why don't we keep moving, and then we will have more conversation time later. So what we were talking about is creativity, and creativity, play, and rest are all wed together. And I was talking at the break about how I do not come to you as an expert. Actually, Phil and I were laughing because you write a book and everyone's like, you're an expert. And I'm like, yeah, it's a lot. I'm a person who is working on these things, and I invite you to work on them with me. And I say that because this question of spirituality, of play, rest, and creativity is a real challenge for me. I mean, I'm kind of stuck in this work all day, tired cycle. And so a really central question for me and my director right now has been, what feeds my soul? Just asking those questions. And the answer was, of course, rest. But then the question became, what is holy rest, right? And I share this because I struggle with rest. And here's what I mean. There's just part of me that has a really rigid definition of rest, such that, I have a lot of like appointments during the days. And so if I have a day off, I don't want to have any appointments, right? So sometimes my friend will be like, do you want to go do this? And I'm like, I'm not free because I need to not do anything. I need to be like bed rest. I need to be lying in state for the day, basically. But the problem with that is that sometimes I need people, right? Like sometimes I need to actually engage in creativity and play. So I get really strict about what rest is. And what that means is that I'm actually acting in opposition to my rest, right? That way, that strictness is held up as a barrier. Because what do I typically do? I watch TV all day, I stay on my sofa all day, when in reality, I could have gone on a walk at the Greenbelt with my friend and seen beauty and seen nature and, had a really joyful, nourishing experience. So what I'm learning is that I have to release some of this rigidity in order to make sure it doesn't prevent my holy rest. Because sometimes the rest my soul needs is the active rest of play, or my soul needs the active rest of creativity. It's not bed rest, but it's soul rest, right? But I also have to have days where I don't do anything at all. Because there were times in my life when emotionally I was really defined by loneliness. And so what I would do is I would try to crowd out every minute of my life with people. So I would go on a vacation and I would go to a place where I had tons of friends and I would make tons of appointments. And it was like working 9 to 5. Like Dolly Parton wrote a song about it. Like I would wake up in the morning and I would have all these appointments, and then I would go home more tired than when I left my house, right? And it was because I had this scarcity around loneliness. And so I had a strictness around feeling like rest had to be social, when what my body really needed was some downtime to rest and to care for myself. And so I say that because when the rigidity of rest meant that I had to be social, I wasn't really receiving holy rest. And when the rigidity of rest meant that I basically had to be in bed all day, I wasn't really receiving holy rest. So the spirituality of play, creativity, and rest is found in this balance, right? The calling is to do the work of really noticing and asking the Spirit, I know I need creativity, rest, and play in my life. So help me discern what feeds my soul. What is holy rest? And for me, it is in trusting my body when it tells me I need a day of bed rest. It's in trusting my mind when it says I need something to inspire my creativity. It's in trusting my people that when I need play and community, I can call on them. And it's entrusting my soul that it will help me discern how to care for my need for rest, creativity, and play. And if it feels hard to honor this need for rest, creativity, and play in a world of hustling harder, remember that if belovedness is your birthright and the spiritual practices of creativity, play, and joy help us slow down long enough to remember our belovedness, then the spiritual practices of creativity, play, and joy are actually integral to our health. Right? These are actually integral to our health because they change how we cope, and coping can really act on the body, right? Also, those seasons when I was super, super social, I got every bug that went around, right? Because my body just needed to rest. Here, I came here early and I had vacation days planned, and I spent yesterday in the bed, all day in the bed, because I knew that that's what my body would need in order for me able to be well today and tomorrow to be with you beautiful people. And there was a time in my life where I didn't have that wherewithal, right? I would have just pushed, and then I might have lost my voice, which is not a great thing when you're a speaker. It doesn't work out in the long run if you lose your voice and you're a speaker. So having that awareness that like it gets to be good to just rest and take care of my body. And so again, the eternal question is, how do we do that? And so I want us to spend the rest of our time together gathering tools, really practical ways for us to think about coping toward our wholeness and our healing. You've already got your 90-second timers, right? You've got your 7-minute meditation. Some of you nodded when I said insight timer, but I do want to mention that again. It's an incredible app. INSIGHT, like insight timer. Tons of meditations. You can search, I do Ignatian, spirituality, examine meditations on it. Yeah, and some of them it's every faith imaginable because anyone can upload it. So sometimes I listen to a couple seconds and move on. That's okay. Sometimes it's not all for everyone, but it's a treasure trove of meditations if you want them. And what I want us to look at is a tool that I encourage in my coaching clients, but also that I encourage for all people. And I call it a first aid kit. And here's why. So when you think of a regular first aid kit, what happens? You need it in emergencies, right? Also, I always find that you don't need it until you do. Do you know what I mean? Like, I went camping for the eclipse, and I took my first aid kit, never used it. But the second you don't have it, you really wish you did because someone's going to skin a knee, right? That's just how it works. So if you actually take your first aid kit, it might mean that nothing happens. That's kind of how that works also. So a first aid kit is something that's good to have on you. You may not use it every day, but you need it, right? And for me, and what we're going to talk about is that a first aid kit is a collection of positive coping tools and positive ways to self-soothe. So we can certainly use it in an emergency, but we can also think of it as a way for us to do preventative care via self-soothing. So imagine with me, I'm sure this has never happened to any of you. Imagine with me that you have a day and you're back to back, right? Like sometimes I have back-to-back calls. So sometimes I don't eat lunch, which I need to work on, right? Back to back to back. The end of the day comes and I am fried, right? So naturally, I'm just going to turn on Netflix and watch whatever because I'm fried. So one of the ways that you can use a first aid kit is to self-soothe throughout the day, right? So let's say you have 5 minutes. Maybe you use one of your tools, right? Just to try to give yourself a little bit of that energy back, because what I call that 5 o'clock is just a powder keg, right? It's all the pent up stress, right? So first aid kits are helpful for literally all people because we all need to cope, right? Coping is not wrong, coping is human. So if you create a first aid kit for yourself, which I encourage you to do after this workshop, it gets to be healing for you, right? So it needs to be fun, right? It needs to be about you. Creating one can be an act of creativity and play, right? When I was quitting drinking, I was very comparative. And so I would look at what other people did, and I would think that that is what I then had to do, right? And so it was really important for me to create some tools that were just what I like to use. You know, if you hate yoga, then don't go look at a yogi's page to get inspiration for your coping tools because you hate yoga. So it's probably not going to work out, right? I always say that running a marathon is not in my toolkit. I have no desire to do that. But for other people, like I know people who are marathon runners, and training for a marathon is a huge part of how they stay sober or cope in a really positive way. So have fun when you create yours. And one of the things that I'm going to do in a second here is I'm going to show you one of my first toolkits and talk through the tools I used and why I used them. Because the question that we're trying to ask when you make it is, what are the tools and resources that would help me heal? What are the tools and resources that would help me heal? It's helpful to have some things practically on you, right? Physical things that we can have with us. Some places that we might put these items are the glove box of a car, right? If you drive to work, or I used to do hospital visits when I was a parish priest, and I would have protein bars in the glove box because sometimes the only meal I could have was driving one hospital to the other. And the difference between a Cliff Bar at noon and no food is very different. You don't want to see me at the end of the day if I haven't had some form of food, right? So being able to just grab that and have that for me. Office desk. My office desk is just like a littering of little tools that are within arm's reach of me, right? So I can just grab them in a quick break. I carry a purse. You may not carry a purse, pockets, pouches, all of those sorts of things are ways that you can have a couple of things on you practically to help you turn to something positive. And for all the challenges it can cause, you might find that some tools are on your phone, right? We've talked about Insight Timer. I like to carry some form of headphones so that if I'm in a crowded place and I need to listen to a meditation, you know, I'm not going to make everybody else listen to it. So I'll just pop my headphones in and have a minute. I spend a lot of time in airports. And so doing some meditations in, Terminal D is something I have been known to do. Also thinking about the idea that the phone is also how you contact people you love. Being able, actually, we'll talk about that when I show you mine, because I have some ideas of ways to kind of give us reminders about how to turn to those things. The reason that we create a first aid kit is because when we're triggered, when we're stressed, when we are wiped out, we are not typically in a brain space to start gathering tools, right? You're triggered, you're tired, you're burned out. That's when we go toward those mindless tools because we just don't have the capacity, right? We don't have the energy to do creative work at that time. So what we want to do is already have our tools, right? I don't have to think of something. I can just turn to this resource that I already have. So let's look at a picture of my little first aid kit. Let's just start at the top right. So I had a little pouch. This pouch was given to me. It was originally my grandmother's. And I get my Jean from her. So I'm Erin Jean Warde, and her name is Jean. And so it was really important for me to have something that connected me to my lineage. that was very personal to me. I keep essential oils because of just deep inhaling. I like to joke that I'm somehow bad at breathing, which I think is real. Like there's all these breath exercises and I'm not good at them, but peppermint can really encourage deep breaths. And just sometimes just a drop of peppermint on my hands, deep inhale it, really encourages breathing. When I'm stressed, lavender can be really good for caring for myself in stress. You'll see my AirPods up there. I almost exclusively call them earbuds, but that's a golden retriever that plays basketball. So they're called AirPods. They're called AirPods. Love having that with me. And the thing is, when we think about our phone as a tool, it may not be a meditation, but you can create a playlist of inspire joy in you, upbeat music, right? You can also create a playlist of like really chill music when you need to just kind of not feel so energized. I like to have some sort of hand cream as a physical way of connecting with my body. So just taking a second to really care for my body when I'm starting to feel anxious or stressed. Sometimes you can get hand creams that are also aromatherapy based. And so that's another thought to have. Meditations of the Heart by Howard Thurman is one of my favorite books. He's probably my favorite theologian. And I think that when we get into that tough, spiraling brain, it can be really important to have words of inspiration and wisdom that help us get centered back into what we actually believe, right? You can write a quote on a 3x5 card and put that in a pouch, but I like to just have some sort of, Bible verses as well, just things that pull me out of that shallow, stressed, tunneled mind. I love a Reese's Pieces. I mean, who doesn't love a Reese's Pieces? That just feels comforting to me. And if I'm hangry, it's a little treat that I get. I'm a writer, and so I like to have a pen and paper with me just to, jot things down, even if I throw them away. Just helpful to have some way to physically write things out. Post-it notes. I just like office supplies. So having some Post-it notes for like permission slips and other things, I just like to have those things around. I like to keep hot tea with me. So sometimes when you're in the airport or other places, you can just ask for hot water and put your tea bag in. So I like to have like something caffeinated, something decaf, a mix of things. And then I have chronic migraines. So I always have to be like treating myself in some way. And when I don't have tools to help my head, I get really anxious. And so I keep the head cool balm, which I can put on my temples and on my forehead, and Advil. I just keep those on my person because I know that if I start to get triggered and start to feel a migraine coming on, I can treat that. And then I love just like a bubbly water. Like I like to have fun, delicious drinks that are obviously non-alcoholic. And so, I don't always have that on my person, but it is considered to be part of what I like to consider as a positive place to turn. Things that are not visible because they kind of can't be visible. And this goes to how fun this is supposed to be. One of the hugest tools in my first aid kit that helped me get sober is stand-up comedy. Who said yes? Yes. Okay. So one of the really beautiful things about getting sober is I found John Mulaney, who's one of my favorite stand-up comedians of all time. And he talked about his sobriety in his bits. And I felt so lonely in my sobriety. I felt like no one else was going through this. So it was so powerful to see someone and say, this person is bright. This person is hilarious. This person is an artist. And they're also sober. And so I can also be all of those things, right? And to laugh, when you feel isolated and you feel like you're working so hard on your sobriety, because sobriety is hard work, right? And sometimes I could get so tunneled into the hard work of sobriety that to be able to have an evening with my seltzer waters laughing and just feeling I didn't feel alone when I listened to that. I also just happened to be obsessed with comedy as an art form. And so I kind of nerd out on different ways of doing comedy. And so it's both creativity and art for me and also play for me. But that's not going to be for everybody, right? But it was really, really important to me to know that I could turn to that. The other thing that is interesting about my experience is, I would get home from work at 5 o'clock and I go to bed at about 10 and I'd be like, what am I going to do for 5 hours? Like it's a long amount of time. And so filling that time with something joyful, like stand-up comedy, something intentional, like an art form that I really appreciate, felt really generative and exciting for me. Also, something that I want to add that I haven't done yet is a gift card to a local coffee shop. The reason I want to do that is as a reminder when I turn to those tools, especially when I'm having one of those sedentary days, when what I really need is to kind of get up and get out and go do something, just like a visible reminder that says, go get a cup of coffee. Like, take your journal, take a fiction book you're reading, go have a cup of coffee, be out, see people, have a lovely day, right? As opposed to just staying inside my home, which may or may not feel fulfilling. On that same note, hot off the press into my first aid kit is that I just got a membership that has a reciprocal membership to my local arboretum. And I was so excited about that because it gives me this thing that I've already invested in that is literally for the purposes of beauty, right? And so on a Saturday when I don't know what I want to do, it's not as if I have to check my budget, right? Like I can just get up and I can go to the arboretum and I can have a beautiful day and I can take a friend, right? So the gift of inviting a friend and saying, I have a membership, like you can just come with me for free and we can go walk at the arboretum. What a great way to get up and enjoy nature and be out a little bit and not have that challenge of, oh, well, I don't have a membership, so I don't know if I can go. No, I can always go there. It can become a safe and joyful haven for me. The other thing I want to mention is I really, really encourage you to make sure that your first aid kits include people, right? So we're dealing with this profound isolation. And I don't know about you, I really struggle with this idea that I don't want to bother anyone. Does anyone else feel that way? Like, I will be in my feelings, lonely, and I'm like, I don't want to bother anybody. Well, guess what? They don't want to bother you either, but you're not bothering each other. And that's why we're not hanging out, right? It's that I don't want to bother you, you don't want to bother me. And so now we're just both depressed alone. Like, we can fix this. An example of thinking through this. So I don't want to bother people, but Easter Sunday is a really emotionally tough time for me because I don't have a family. So I typically go to church alone because I don't serve in a congregation, right? So I go to church alone and everyone else is doing family things and everyone else has these brunches after church and I don't have any of that. And it's this big joyful day. And so literally like by Maundy Thursday, I was already dreading Easter Sunday. And I was like, well, that doesn't feel good. Like, I want to be really excited about Easter Sunday because Jesus has died and is risen. So I just texted my friend Mallory, who's a really close friend of mine, and I said, here's the deal. I'm already in a funk about it. Would you be willing to have brunch with me on Sunday after church? And Mallory doesn't go to church. She has a toddler right now, and it's really hard. But we made reservations, and I was vulnerable, right? And I just said, I think I'm going to be really lonely that day, and it would mean the world to me if we could hang out. And for me, and we had a gorgeous brunch, and then we were so enjoying our time together. We ended up going to a coffee shop after, and we like really spent the day together. And I went home, and I had had church, and I had had community, and I like went home and thought, this is like one of the best Easters I've ever had. But I was willing to be vulnerable, and I could have not wanted to bother her and just gone home and been depressed, even though I should be resonating with the alleluias, right? And so it was a huge reminder to me that it's good for me to just say, hey, I'm struggling. Is it okay if we get together? And we can do that when it's not Easter, right? I also think that, if it's just a casual hang, someone might cancel on you. But typically when you say to someone, I'm kind of having a hard time, would it be okay? People are like, obviously. Like, even if you just come over in your jammies and we watch Netflix together, you certainly don't have to do that alone, right? I have rushed over with takeout, and other people would do that for me too. And another thing that I would say is if you're building a first aid kit with a pouch, to write out a list of people and say, I'm allowed to call these people when I'm struggling. I know Mallory is one of those people for me. I have another friend, Sarah, who is like family to me. But to write that out and to really say, call Mallory, call Sarah, call these people, reach out to them. You're allowed to do that. I also think the good thing about the coffee shop card, the reality is sometimes your friends are busy, right? Like that is real life. And so sometimes if I can't access a close friend, just going to a place and being around other people gives me that like buoying feeling. And so that can even in and of itself be a balm. So making sure we have lots of different tools that can help us with that loneliness that we might feel. And another tool, so the first aid kit is great. A tool that is kind of wedded to that in some ways, and I'm going to pass out this worksheet. So the tool that we're going to talk about, and you can do this now, you can do this later, is HALT. And yes, I see some knowing nods. A lot of people know HALT. HALT just like saves my life. I can't explain it. So this should be 4. Oh, great. There it is. So yes, somebody else already said it. So hungry, angry, lonely, and tired. This should be more than enough. And the reason that I love this tool is because you'd be shocked how many times I use it and find out I haven't had food in like 7 hours. So obviously, let me know if that's not enough. I end up getting hangry. And let me make sure you get another one. There you go. And HALT is such a powerful check-in. And it's so simple, right? So if you start to feel triggered, if you start to feel emotionally off, to stop and ask yourself, am I hungry? Am I angry? Am I lonely? Am I tired? The reason we have this acronym, and a lot of people were nodding, is because it's really common in recovery circles. And one of the reasons it's really common in recovery circles is these are 4 of the main triggers that can trigger you to want to turn to maladaptive coping mechanisms, right? One of the really interesting things about the human brain is it doesn't parse cravings very well, right? So you can be craving food, but you might drink at that, right? Because all you feel is a craving. And so making sure that we're addressing these 4 really core needs can be really, really helpful. And let's go through them a little bit. We have enough time. So when I think about HALT for me, when it comes to hunger, actually, let me back up. One other thing to do is to think about your first aid kit as making sure it addresses HALT, right? Make sure you have the tools to address HALT in your first aid kit. So we've talked through some of these, right? Hungry, protein bar in my glove box, right? Having my Reese's Pieces in my little bag is a way for me to address hunger if it pops up. In terms of anger, we've talked a little bit about meditation. Sometimes I'll do a meditation for anger if that feels really prevalent. Sometimes when I'm angry, in anger, I stew. So I just circle the drain about whatever issue I have. Literally just like physically getting up, going outside, walking around the neighborhood, getting some sunshine. It just gets me out of that stewing space where I'm just stuck in that spiral. We've talked quite a bit about loneliness, right? Calling a friend, having some tools in your toolkit. And when it comes to being tired, the first thing I want to say is that we live in a culture that says that when you're tired, you need an energy drink, which is the way that our culture says when you're tired, you should push past the cues of your body because this is how you're more productive, right? And we care about the widgets you're producing. So my first thought is when you're tired, the response is to rest. But rest is hard. We've talked about it. And like, I'm not always a nap person because it can disrupt my sleep in the evening. But one thing that I will do is just try to like not use any devices because those are exhausting in their own way. They're exhausting on your eyes. And so I might just go sit outside for 5 minutes or go on one of those walks, which can be energizing, but in a positive way, as opposed to just like hitting yourself with tons of caffeine. And then also making sure that we're nurturing our sleep patterns, right? So you may not be able to rest when you're tired at 10 a.m., but also if you're tired at 10 a.m., it might mean that having an evening routine that cares for you and helps you get some deeper rest in the evening could be really helpful for you. So that's like one way to use HALT. And I've got this worksheet here. And I think what we might do is we might just take time to do both of these worksheets in groups. So the other tool that I want to introduce that we're going to workshop together is a joy and rest practices list. So we talked a lot about how hard rest is, how hard creativity is, how hard play is. And so similar to some other tools we've talked about, when we're fried, that's not the time to start grabbing our tools. And so when I have a day off, something that's really helpful for me is to have a joy and rest practices list because all I'm doing is doing something off the list as opposed to coming up with something cool to do today, right? So my list might be, I'm going to go to the Arboretum or coffee shop, and I just get to pick something on the list. And I worked with a client once, and his whole thing is that he boredom drank. He would just get bored and he would drink. And so very early on, we figured that out. And I was like, you have to have a joy and rest practices list. Like, you need things to do. And he emailed me one day and he said, last night, I didn't drink. He said, I did everything on my list, but I didn't drink, right? And so you can do everything on the list. But what he said is he was like, and I had a great time. He's like, I went for a walk. I did a puzzle. I went out to dinner with my wife. I played a board game with my kids. And I woke up the next morning and I was sober. And it was such an incredible night of connection with every member of my family and with myself. Period. Right? So you can do everything on it. And obviously some of the things on my joy and rest practices list are things like go on a trip, which I can't randomly do one night. But the way that that was so powerful for him to not have to come up with things to do and not turn to that boredom drinking. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a second and work on these worksheets. And if you look at the worksheet that I'm handing out now, making a joy and rest practices list, the questions that we're going to explore together are, how can I rest in mind, body, and soul? So what are practices that are restful? Also, what are activities that are fun and enlivening, right? So we want to make sure that there's excitement and energy and things to do that when we crave fun. Also, what are practices that are simple? Because if our practice for the night is to read War and Peace, we're probably going to feel a little defeated by that when we start doing it. one of the big tools to habit change is making sure that our tools are accessible to us, that they are small, right? Because one of the things that happens is that when your way to cope is big, you feel like you're not going to do it, so you don't do it at all. The difference between a goal of I'm going to read an entire book before I go to bed and I'm going to read a chapter is that one of those two things I can probably do, right? So what are practices I can add that are simple? Also, what can I do that is passive? So when we think of that, when we need to reduce our energy, when we're stressed and we're maxed out. Also, what can I do that is active, that will increase my energy when I need a boost? So if I'm feeling a little bit depressive and I need that boost to get up and maybe go do something. And then also, what brings me joy? What is a just purely joyful act? And so what I want to ask us to do is take the first, okay, it's 11:42. So why don't we come back at 12:15? Does that sound too long? Good. Okay. And spend the first 15 minutes on HALT, last 15 minutes on joy and rest practices list. If you feel like you've finished one up and want to pivot to the next, we're all adults here. But by the end of it, you'll have tools to help you with HALT, and you'll have a joy and rest practices list that I think will create some really nourishing practices for your coping tools. So as a group, and then we'll do some kind of reporting back and Q&A. In the main, we're going to take a second to gather back in the main. I am so grateful to a room that is very talkative, because one of the things that I want is to not just talk about the loneliness in our community, but to maybe offer the opportunity for you to receive some of that balm today, right? In these communities of talking to one another. And I want to take a minute to open things up. What I would encourage is if there are any tools that you love and that you want to share, please share them. Or if you have questions, thoughts, this will be how we kind of bring our time together to a close in a free, open commenting space. And if you're on Zoom, I want to first of all say thank you for being here. It's a blessing to see you. And that openness to asking questions includes you. So it may take a minute for me to see who's talking and to address you, but I certainly want you to be involved in this greater community conversation. So on that note, what are things that are sticking out to you? What are tools that maybe feel powerful for you? And what are some other questions that you might have? Yes, 1 second. Oh, yes, and there will be a microphone coming to you.
Shoot, I forgot, or I wouldn't have raised my hand.
We're all Frit family here now.
I really like the timers, the 90 seconds, the 7 minutes. It either made something really big, like it set a limit if I'm doing it too long, or it was an entry to even trying something if I thought it'd be too big.
Yes, and I need that, the accessibility. Containers, right? Can I put this in a container? Beautiful. I'm so glad that was helpful for you.
I would certainly welcome anyone at our table to expound on this, but we talked a fair amount about how practicing gratitude can really change the entire dynamic of our lives and our relationships.
Yes, and I would just add that there is neuroscience behind the way that practicing gratitude shifts. And to your point of what you asked earlier about holding that joy, even amidst that suffering, to be able to still do our gratitude lists. Something that I did for a very long time that I want to get back into is I would do a journal spread, and on the left, I would do gratitude, and on the right, I would do prayer requests. And so it was this way that I could hold all the things I'm grateful for, and also all the weights of the world that needed to be offered to God in prayer as a way of kind of balancing your comment. So yes, gratitude practice is really pivotal.
I came to stand next to my friend Emily because we share a spiritual practice that brings us joy, collage.
Well, I will add to that that I decorate those notebook pages with cutouts from magazines, and my journals and my planners, I'll paste in little pieces of magazines to, because that's a little creativity that I can offer even into the mundane, right? And so much of spirituality is about finding the gift of joy and creativity even in the mundane realities of life. So collaging is actually a practice I'm really involved in as well.
Most of my practices, I feel like revolve around the feeling of like self-efficacy as an antidote to shame. When I was early in recovery, like 6 or 7 years ago from drug and alcohol use, so much of it was like, just don't use the substances. And then there was like no talk about, but once you're not doing that, you're left with the shame. And what do you do instead? And so I felt like everyone was congratulating me for being sober, but not talking about everything else. So it's only several years later that I'm like, okay, how do I build up this feeling of I can do the hard things? I can tackle the hard things. I can live my life. It's not going to be easy, but I'm still capable. And so 2 things for me, one of them is like kind of having like a personal theme song that I can listen to every day. I stole this from someone who I heard right into KEXP, the like local independent radio station, that every morning they listen to Light of a Clear Blue Morning by Dolly Parton. And that's like their song every single morning, and it hypes them up and it gives them this feeling of like, whatever happens today, I can handle it. It won't necessarily be like fun or easy or pleasant, but like some music to ground them and motivate them. And then last year, I started running really regularly. I was never a runner my entire life. I was like, this is not for me. I hate it. Other people can do this. I'm not going to. And then I broke my arm and I was like, well, I have to exercise somehow. So I started running. And at first I was really slow. I was really not great at it. But I kept at it. And every single time I run, it builds up that feeling of self-efficacy.
Yeah.
And this is something that I didn't think I could do at all prior, but now I'm doing it and I'm practicing it. And each time I go a little bit farther or a little bit faster, and it gets me out of my head. I'm not ruminating. I'm just in my body. It's like almost a prayer. I mean, it is a prayer practice. And each time there's a little bit of accomplishment. It's not even something tangible. Like I can't take my run with me. I don't have to store it in my apartment, but I can like log it on my phone and I can look back and like, here's all the places I've run and my times and mileage. And yeah, it's cool.
Well, and it heads toward just embodied practice. Like something that I struggle with is being really in my mind. And one of the best ways to care for being really stuck in your mind is to get into your body. And so what you're doing is getting into your body. The other thing I was going to say, I love that you have a theme song. Something else that I've heard of that I really like the idea of is when you're about to do something that requires a lot of confidence. If you've ever gone to a baseball game, they have a walkout song. And it's like the song that hypes them up as they go to the plate. And so I was listening to someone who said we should all have walkout songs. Like, you know, what's your song that just makes you feel powerful and strong and ready to like rock it? And when you talk about your early recovery, confidence is something that we know has to be really nurtured and cared for and built within a recovery situation, because we can feel so low. Right. And so getting into that joy is to lift our confidence and to lift our self-esteem. And so I'm really pleased to hear the ways that you've been able to cultivate that.
Hi, my name's Kathy. And one of the things that I started writing down tools before you gave us the little assignment, because of course I'm type A. And so one of the things making a joy and restless that fulfills each one of these for me is music. And sometimes I just listen to music and sometimes I sing. That's one of the things that COVID really took from me was group singing. And I especially enjoy singing sacred music. And so the other night I had realized, I don't know about you guys, I know I don't look like it because I'm a white middle-aged lady, but I get othered a lot. And I had realized that I was on the receiving end of a bunch of microaggressions that I was like, why do I feel so crappy? Oh. And so I had this feeling during the day. I'd realized it during my workday. And so what I did is I went on YouTube and found songs I could sing along with really, really loudly. I turned up the sound really loud. And it was like Hallelujah and Josh Groban's You Lift Me Up, stuff like that. It was sacred music that I could find, pentatonics and all that kind of stuff, but that I knew all the words to, so I could sing along. And I just, and then I played some of them over multiple times. And then I was like, ooh, I wonder if I can harmonize with that. I'm not really good at harmonizing right off the bat, but I was able to do some creative singing and nobody was there to say, oh, you're flat, or anything like that. So, and that made me feel so much better because I believe that she who sings prays twice.
Well, and I would say, what I was saying about art earlier, have you ever seen a kid sing and say, you're actually not on pitch, honey? Like, no, you're just so overjoyed that there's this beautiful voice singing, right? Like when kids sing, it's just this really beautiful thing to behold. And so the fact that you're able to offer that and not have that comparison, that am I flat going on in your head, that's some of that inner child work that can really nurture the fact that it is beautiful to do that for the sense and purpose of doing that, like just offering that to God. And that God, divinity is so pleased with what we offer and overjoyed to be connected to us. And so what a joy that is for your gift to be received. I love that. Also, driving around with the windows down and the music up is one of the ways I deal with anger. Lots of breathing, lots of screaming lyrics or belting out positive songs. It just gets things up and out of your brain and out of your, doesn't let them. There you go. Other thoughts and tools or questions or reflections that you want to offer in the community?
Well, I just think this is so valuable in so many ways because it's like tools for living and practical things. All of us have, we all go through these multiple layers of stressors that we don't even realize. And I do things like art, and sketching and going out and having, and just even spending a short amount of time doing that and knowing it's not going to be framed. It looks like maybe a fifth grader did it if I'm honest, some of it, but it doesn't matter because by doing that, you're taking more time observing. And that's really the first thing. The other thing about this is I live with other people and multi-age household right now. And so it's been challenging in its way. It's enriching too. But, like just when I think of triggers or certain times of day that can be pressure, like the 5 o'clock dinner hour or leading up to it. And we were talking about that. Just ways to get unstuck or pull back from that kind of stress by going for a walk or changing the scene, somehow. And the news is on typically too. And, there's just, so we're just living in a time when there's those kinds of things that permeate the atmosphere all the time. So I just appreciate tools to be mindful of really how to deal with my own issues and things, but also being compassionate for those around me who are also going through their things. And there's aging, there's multiple things going on, but so thank you.
Yes, no, it's a joy. And one of the things that you reminded me of is that the other thing that can be really, really powerful if we're in cycles where we end the workday in a way that we don't love is to just try to come up with a different ritual to end your day, right? Because what's happening is that it's a neural pathway. Like the cue is closing your laptop or the cue is ending your day. And so maybe you're going to go sit on your patio and drink a cup of herbal tea at 5 o'clock as a way to get centered before you start your day, right? Just any way to kind of interrupt those patterns, and having some of these tools that you can say, okay, at 5 o'clock, I'm going to grab one of these little things and do that so that I start my night in a different way can be really powerful.
Pamela, would you like to unmute?
Yes. Hi. In our discussion about dealing with tiredness, some of us have constraints, like children, that prevent some of the tools. But a change, like I was thinking of it in terms of a change in mind and vision focus. You know, just it helps your eyes if you look away from your computer and look at the mountains instead. So just a small change. That also it brings up self-efficacy. You have the ability to change what you're doing, what your surroundings are in a small, short way. Thanks.
Absolutely. And a tool that I would add to that, that is somewhat common in recovery circles, is to be able to pause long enough to find 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can taste, right? And then what's the other one? Smell, and then something you can smell. And the way you divvy up 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 is less of the challenge. But what it does is it can take us out of the brain and into the sensory parts of our body. And so when you were talking about looking out at the mountain, that's such a great sensory refocus. And another thing that I will do when I need to rest, but I don't want to nap, is I will just lay down and close my eyes, because there's so much stimulus around me that I'm not scrolling, I'm not listening, I'm not doing anything. I may not fall asleep, but I'm just going to take a second to not have all the sensory weight of what's around me. And I do open my eyes and I feel refreshed, right? So that's an incredible, incredible tool to mention. I appreciate that so much.
Say that again. Yes. So the question is, can the 2 worksheets be shared? I'll send them out to everyone that registered. Thank you.
And you
on the website.
The slide deck, you can put the slide deck up too. I mean, y'all can have whatever you want.
Well, many of you know I've been going through a season of chaos, to say the least. And I'm going to put in a plug-in for morning prayer. Every morning, a group gets together on Zoom, which you can hook into. And that half hour of time sets my day in such a loving and caring manner, I can get through it all. So tune in. We'd love to have you.
Thanks, Cinda.
I would piggyback on that. So ideally, we always do that in community, right? Another app that I will mention is it's from Forward Movement. There's 2 of them, and it's a morning at prayer, and it's an evening at the office. And what they've done, and you might hear me at some point, because what we did is we recorded the scripture readings so you can listen to people pray at the office. And so I mentioned that because so many people, and I would guess especially in Seattle, so many of us are commuting, right? And so what if instead of just driving, you listened to morning prayer, a 30-minute recording? Again, ideally we want to be in community, but it's nice because there's an officiant, there's a different voice reading, there's a different, so it feels like you're actually in the place. And so all of that are just resources that we can turn to help us not have to say, oh, well, I can't do that because I've got to drive, or I can't do that because I'm busy. Sometimes I'll turn it on and I'll make my coffee and I'll just pray along. And it's just like a companion with me as I get ready for the day.
Good. Well, mindful of our time, we'll draw to a close here. Just a couple of housekeeping things. I have a few books left. If you want to buy one of Erin's Sober Spirituality books, just see me afterwards. I had one other announcement, which has left me at this point. Oh yes, surveys. Surveys, you have one on your table. Folks in Zoom have one from SurveyMonkey, a link. And I've actually emailed all of you a link too, but if you want to complete it here, that would be great. We also, if you'll pause just for a moment from that, let's acknowledge and give thanks and gratitude for Erin. Yeah. Erin, thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing wisdom and in encouraging us on the spiritual journey as well. And we look forward to being with you tomorrow. And you got a long day ahead of you tomorrow too. So pace yourself. Yeah.
And I wanted to say thank you. I'm always very aware that there are a million places we could be right now. And so it's a real gift and honor that you chose to be here. So bless you and thank you. Thank you.